What we refer to as the classical era in music is a little bit tricky. When you look in the disciplines of literature and the visual arts, they don't really talk about this period as being classical so much. Really, this time period is kind of absorbed into what they refer to as the Romantic era. But in music, we refer to this time period as from about the middle of the 1700s, about 1750 to about 1825, so roughly from the death of Bach to almost the time that Beethoven died, as the classical period. Now, classicism is very difficult to pinpoint in time because it's always been a constant concern in the Western traditions. It's rooted in the values of order and reason that were expressed by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and this actually laid the foundation for the European identity. These classical ideas come back again and again and again, and they tend to coexist with other styles, which is one of the reasons why it's really hard to pinpoint, and it's one of the reasons why some other disciplines don't even recognize this as a style, at least in this particular time period. And most of the time when you talk about the classical period, you're actually talking about the ancient Greek and Romans. I guess technically this period should be called the neoclassical period. The problem is there's a movement in the 20th century that's identified as the neoclassical. So you can see that it's a little bit fuzzy when you start comparing it to the other art forms. But we're going to talk about classicism in a general sense here. These classical ideas started to reemerge with some energy in the late 1700s, about the same time as the Enlightenment. If you remember, the Enlightenment was a philosophical and intellectual movement that stressed order, logic, and reason. And artists followed suit in this movement, and they created works that were characterized by clarity and regularity of structure. And they had this ideal of a natural simplicity. An international musical style developed, and it was then and still is considered as being timeless, and it was an embodiment of musical logic. Previous styles came and went out of fashion, but the classical style has persevered. It's still at the very core of the Western art tradition. This age saw the rule of very strong aristocratic sovereigns, people who ruled by hereditary right. And a few examples of these are you've got Louis XV, who ruled from Versailles in France. You've got Frederick the Great in Prussia, which Prussia is part of what later became Germany. Maria Theresa in Austria, and Catherine the Great in Russia. However, a new economic power was rising due to the Industrial Revolution, which saw significant advances in science and important inventions. A few examples are James Watt improved the steam engine. Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Benjamin Franklin harnessed electricity, and a man named Edward Jenner perfected the vaccination. We also saw advancements in intellectual life, such as the first publications of encyclopedias, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But this was the age of reason and enlightenment. Social and political issues were approached with reason. They were approached as a science of their own. At the same time, philosophers started to advocate for the rise of the middle class, and this led to several revolutionary upheavals by the end of the century. The ancient Greeks and Romans were idealized during this time. There was really a quest for the unity and proportions of ancient architecture and the fine arts. These things were revered, and that sparked a classical revival, especially in the United States. Thomas Jefferson modeled the nation's capital, the University of Virginia, and his home in Monticello after Greek and Roman temples. Now, simultaneously, in the 1760s, we had this emerging romantic view in literature, starting with a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was a French philosopher. He's known as the father of Romanticism. He said once, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." And that kind of summed up the mood of the times. Now, you might remember from a government class or a U.S. history class that he's the guy that wrote about the social contract. He's the guy that wrote that the government should serve the people. And as I just alluded to, he was very influential in the formation of the United States. Another movement was called the Sturm und Drang, the storm and stress. This was a literary movement that started in Germany. It was characterized by expression of emotional unrest. And even though he wasn't from Germany, it was influenced by Rousseau. And this movement tended to exalt nature, feelings, and individualism. The idea behind this movement was they wanted to overthrow the Enlightenment cult of rationalism. Goethe and Schiller were a couple individuals who began their careers as part of this movement. And we're going to talk about Goethe quite a bit when we get into the Romantic Age, because he's going to be a favorite source for Romantic composers to base their songs upon. Schiller's poem Ode to Joy was set by Beethoven in his Ninth Symphony, and it was a proclamation of universal brotherhood. Classicism in music is really characterized by the music of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, and then extended a little bit later to Schubert. And these gentlemen collectively are referred to as the Viennese school, or the first Viennese school. And we're going to refer back to that Viennese school a little bit when we get to the composers Schoenberg, Webern, and Berg in the 20th century, who are referred to as the second Viennese school. But in any case, the Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, and Schubert led an age of musical experimentation. And one of the things that they did was they really explored the possibilities of the major-minor system. And they also perfected large-scale instrumental form known as sonata form or sonata allegro form. And they developed this form into different types of pieces, solo and duo sonatas, the trio and the quartet, especially the string quartet, the concerto, and the symphony. Talk a little bit about the elements of classical style in music. It was most notable for elegant lyrical melodies. And when we refer to lyrical melodies, we're referring to something that is very song-like, something that's very easy to hum along to, sing along to, whistle along to, whatever. That's what we're referring to here. The melodies were based on very symmetrical four-bar phrases with clear-cut cadences. And what a cadence is, if you don't remember from our earlier chapters back at the beginning of the course, a cadence is the ending of a phrase. Think of a cadence as a punctuation at the end of a sentence. When you're at the end of a sentence, you come to a period, a question mark, whatever, maybe at a certain point in a sentence you have a comma. And if somebody is reading to you in a way that's easy to understand, it's easy for you to hear when their phrases come to an end. Well, the same thing is true with music, especially instrumental music, is when they come to an end of a phrase, it's very clear to hear that. And that was one of the characteristics of the classical melody. They provided clarity through repetition, through frequent use of a sequence. And a sequence is if you take the same basic melodic idea and you start it on a different pitch level. Either it could be higher or lower, whatever. But they're taking the same idea and just kind of moving it around higher or lower. And also very balanced structures. And what this created was music that was very accessible to the listener. Okay, you didn't have to be a musical snob and have a degree in music to be able to get this and understand it. It was very easy for people to pick up on. And one thing that I always tell people to remember, when people in Mozart's day listened to music, listen to Mozart, they didn't think of him as this classical stuffy composer. This was the popular music of the day. If there was I don't know, 93.3 FM in 1780, they would have been playing the music of Mozart and Haydn. Okay, so this was very accessible. It was very easy to listen to. It's one of the reasons why this music is still popular today. Even people that don't like classical music, so to speak, will say, oh, but I like Mozart. Okay, because it was very easy for people to get. Another feature was very clear diatonic harmonies. Now, what diatonic refers to is if you take, and we've alluded to this before, we talked about the idea of tonal music being based on a hierarchy of notes within a hierarchical collection of notes that are all related to a particular key. Okay, so a diatonic harmony means that all of the chords are made up of notes that belong to that key. So what does that mean? That means that when you listen to it, it's going to be pleasant to your ear. It's not something that's going to challenge you and make you, cringe when you hear it. It's not going to be very dissonant harmony. There's going to be some dissonance in there to give it some forward motion, but it's not going to be hard to listen to. And this music also embodied homophonic texture, which just a quick review on that was homophonic texture basically means that you have a melody that is supported by chords. The classical style utilized very basic meters, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 6/8, and also very steady tempos. And during this time period, usually if a piece started in a particular meter, it stayed in that same meter for the entire piece. Even though this was music that was really beloved by the aristocracy, they still made frequent use of folk and popular elements within the classical style. Now, later music starts becoming more and more romantic, and we're going to talk about that a little bit once we get into Beethoven. The patronage system is basically just sponsorship of aristocracy. See, the arts were viewed as a necessary adornment of life, and music was part of the nobility's elaborate lifestyle. The center of the musical life was the palace. And there was a steady demand for new works. But this led to economic security and some kind of a social framework for composers. Now, I want to just add something here. Under this patronage system, the musicians and composers weren't very high up in the social ladder at this time. In fact, people used to have the superstition that listening to music aided in digestion of food, and which is, by the way, well, let me not get too ahead of myself here, but they believe that music aided in the digestion of food, so the composers and the musicians actually worked under the umbrella of the kitchen help. Okay, so the idea here was that they composed music to be played while they ate because they thought it was healthier, and that's where the tradition of dinner music actually started. Well, just to use Mozart as an example, Mozart was a guy who really bristled at the idea that he had to take orders from the chef. Why should I, who is a genius, have to take orders from a guy that peels potatoes all day? Mozart didn't that wasn't cool with him. So he did everything he could do to get out of this patronage system, and that was mixed blessings with that. But we'll talk more about that when we get to the chapters on Mozart. Haydn, by comparison, actually lived very well under the patronage system, but we'll talk more about him when we get to the chapter on Haydn. But that just kind of sets the table, so to speak, for the patronage system and how that played out. We have to discuss opportunities for women during this time. Now, in Italy and France, women were very prominent in opera and ballet. They also had positions as court instrumentalists and music teachers for members of the nobility. Most performances, though, by women at that time were in aristocratic salons, at court, and in the home. In general, though, the growth of music trades provided more outlets for women to display their talents. Now, two prominent women keyboard players of this time were actually associated with Mozart. First, we have Maria Anna Mozart, who was named or nicknamed Nan Earl. She was Mozart's sister, and she toured extensively with Mozart when she was younger. We'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the Mozart chapters, but when the two Mozart children were very young, their father Leopold toured them throughout Europe, and they performed concerts for royalty and for nobility. But when Nan Earl got a little bit older, Leopold decided that it was time for her to give that life up and devote her time to, he wanted to get her married and have her, seek a more honorable profession of being a wife and a mother. Maria Theresa von Paradis was a friend of Mozart. She was blind. She was a accomplished composer, but she was an excellent pianist and organist. She was actually really well known for her musical memory. And if my memory serves, I believe she had over 60 concertos that she had memorized that she could perform at any given time. And she played them on an extensive tour throughout Europe. Let me say a few words about performance matters during this time. During this time, music started to really move from the palace to the concert hall. With the rise of the public concert, performers and composers had new venues in which to perform their music. Haydn and Beethoven, for instance, conducted their own symphonies, and Mozart and Beethoven performed their own piano concertos. And the audiences absolutely rushed to hear the new music. Now, that's not at all like modern concert goers. People nowadays, they want to go and hear old works. They want to hear the works of Beethoven and Mozart and Schubert and Chopin. They don't really want to hear a lot of the modern works. But this rush to hear the new music led composers to become very, very productive. Now, virtuosic performers were still popular during this time, but the clarity and the simplicity of the style really appealed to both amateur performers and listeners. Music started to be described as a communication or a dialogue, and this could be between different performers, it could be between the performers and the audience, or between the composer and the audience. And this idea of instrumental storytelling actually led to a deeper connection between the composer genius and a receptive listener. Let me take a little digression here and go back into the idea of science, philosophy, and music in this age of enlightenment. The 18th century, as we kind of alluded to before, looked towards the advancement of knowledge through reason and science. And among the leaders of this movement, there was a guy named Voltaire who was a philosopher. You might have heard of him. He's another guy who was really influential in the formation of the United States. He was really known for his ideas on freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the separation of church and state. And then, of course, we had Sir Isaac Newton, and you all know about him and his discovery of the law of gravity. But these two and people like them really sought to understand everything that they could understand according to nature and math, not religion. Scholars began to collect information. They wanted to increase the overall body of knowledge, and at the same time, society really started to embrace a focus on learning, and that led to the publication of the French Encyclopédie. And this was written in part by Voltaire and Rousseau. I think it was about 35 volumes, something like that, of just people writing on a variety of different subjects. Well, musicians joined in on the game as well. Rousseau, and most people don't know this, but he was actually also a composer. He published a dictionary of musical terms. There's a man by the name of Jean-Philippe Rameau who wrote an important book on music theory. And any music theory people out there, if you remember your horrible days in music theory class when you had to analyze music and use the Roman numeral 1, 4, and 5 and assign it to the different chords within a piece. Well, that was Rameau's creation. He's the guy that came up with the Roman numeral analysis and the whole idea of categorizing music along those lines. There was a man from England by the name of Charles Burney who wrote the first music history textbook. He tried to compile everything that we knew about music and the music composers. Some very celebrated technological achievements were also connected to music. Music boxes. And we've all seen the music box. You crank up the handle and let it go, and it plays. And those were actually made by clockmakers. There was something called an automata, which these were musical machines that resembled human beings, and some of them were life-size, and they would play a variety of instruments like flutes or whatever. Now, for today's terms, we look at our CGI, this wouldn't be that impressive. But again, going back to the 1700s, this was state-of-the-art technology. We mentioned Benjamin Franklin already a little bit earlier, but and we talked about his experiments with electricity, but he was known for several inventions too. He invented lightning rod, he invented the bifocal glasses and the Franklin stove, but he also invented a musical instrument known as the glass harmonica, and this was an instrument made of tuned water glasses. Now, believe it or not, Mozart and Beethoven actually composed works for the glass harmonica. Franklin was also a musician. He played guitar, so he's close to my place close to my heart, and he played the harp. Now, he wrote a book about musical aesthetics, and he really promoted the idea of harmonic simplicity. So you see, it's really easy to relate Enlightenment's goals of reason, thought, and simplicity to the music of this era. The elements of music, melody, harmony, rhythm, things like that, and the structure exhibit clarity, balance, and logic that were very, very new to composition. And the intent was to create a universally understandable language of sound. They succeeded.